Hello everyone. We're going to have a panel with the three keynoters you see this morning, so Bridget, Susanne and Ken. You have the possibility to ask them any question you have, so it can be something that you heard at the keynote or something you saw in another session. So just these are three experts, so feel free to ask any question. Just use this hashtag on Twitter and I will ask them your questions. For the most interesting questions, we're gonna have some gifts for you. We have 4 Kafka Stream in Action from Manning. And so let me introduce you the panelists. So, thanks for coming. I will let you introduce yourself.
So my name's Ken Finnigan. I lead the Thorntail and Small Rye projects for Red Hat, soon to be IBM. And I'm heavily involved in Eclipse Microprofile and all things microservices in the cloud.
My name is Susanne Kaiser. I am from Hamburg, Germany, and I am an independent tech consultant. And I used to be a startup CTO, transforming our SaaS solution from monoliths to microservices.
All right. Hi, I'm Bridget Kromhout, and I'm on the Cloud Developer Advocacy team at Microsoft, where, as I mentioned this morning, they issued me a Mac and told me to get people to use Linux, which just makes us all conclude 2018 is very weird.
Okay. So thanks. First question is, what are the common pitfalls when you switch from a monolithic architecture to a microservices?
I can share a lot of pitfalls. There are the first pitfall that we ran into was when we identified the first candidate for microservices, and that was the bounded context of a collaboration app. So our SaaS solution, where I used to be the CTO of the startup, they are providing collaboration apps. And so we identified the first candidate and started with it. And it was a very high level bounded context that we used. But what we did in the extraction process is that we put too many steps in once, so we put so much load on our shoulder, because we not only extracted the candidate as a coexisting solution from scratch, service from scratch, we also integrated we can also add some new features during this transformation process. We can also make significant changes to the data structure. Let's also change the user interface, and we all did it and tried to do it at the same time. So it took a very long time to retrieve the first experiences with microservices. So it was really took months to get the first service out. And so we had so much a load on our shoulder, and so with the next one we started with a smaller candidate to identify. And then also we had another issue, I'm sharing them tomorrow as well in my talk, is that we deferred or delayed the handling of cross-cutting concerns like authorization handling. So what happened as a productive consequence was that we were on the one side feeding the monolith, and on the other side re-implementing a cross-cutting concern. So handling cross-cutting concerns from the very beginning is very, very helpful to decompose your monolith into microservices.
So Bridget, do you want to add something?
I'm sorry?
Do you want to add something?
I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, it's almost like Sam Newman was not wrong when he talked about the strangler pattern. I think you're so right. Every time I've tried to do a giant project all at once, it just leads to sadness. Pick one thing, do part of it, iterate, repeat. So right.
That's true.
Okay, perfect. Ken, how do you deal with logs and metrics?
Well, I guess it's not that dissimilar from a lot of environments now. If you've got multiple middleware app servers running, you're more than likely you've got several of them, and they each have their own logs, and you need some way to collect them all together to get an overall view of all your systems. It's somewhat similar to that, but in the likes of Kubernetes, obviously Prometheus is the kind of big one there. And that allows you to have a single instance of that and basically suck in all the metrics from all the applications within that environment into Prometheus. So it can give you that one view of everything. I think for the logging side of things, there are various options. Was that the EFK stack is probably one of the more popular ones. But there are definitely other options there as well.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that I think we see a lot of people talk about things like, what can I observe, or buzzwords like observability. And I think it's not that there's one right tool, but it makes a lot of sense to realize you're not going to know all the questions to ask right off the bat. And so when you talk about, say, Prometheus, like that's a great idea to get your logs in one place and be able to look at them. And you might find out that you aren't logging everything you thought you were.
Right, and it's also a case of just being able to capture that in a central way so that sometime down the road, like using Kafka or anything else, you can then process that information in different ways once you have a better understanding of how your system should work or isn't working. So you can interrogate the same data and maybe see some behaviors that you missed before.
Yeah, or if you're looking for cross correlations, you talked earlier about just cross-cutting. Like I would say thinking about looking at like the open tracing project, just to make sure that you have an ability to trace a request through, because we're on the microservices topic, you're like, we have problems. Which one of you are my enemies today? And it's like all of the services, they're all your enemies if they're not answering these questions for you.
Okay, thanks. And how do you deal with load balancing and scaling? It's easy when you have only one server, but there you have multiple multi-services that does a lot of different things. So,
it's an interesting topic, but I think something that you need to keep in mind is that when you had your traditional app server and you may have had a couple of things running on it and you could scale the whole thing in one go easily by having multiple servers, more often than not, you didn't need to scale the whole server. There might have been small pieces here and there that were causing performance issues and might have needed to be scaled, but you didn't necessarily need to scale the whole thing. So it might be a little bit different having to scale each piece individually, but you're going to get much better performance across your hardware doing that than having to scale an entire app server just for this small thing here that might need a little bit of extra oomph.
So you also can. So what we have integrated is the Netflix OSS, because our microservices, they are mainly consisting of Spring Boot applications, and so we have used a lot of the Netflix OSS for circuit breaking and also for client-side load balancing.
okay. And we talk about load balancing, but what about versioning? How do you handle multiple versions of each web service that depends one from each other? How do you handle this mess?
Versioning. Usually is introduce a new version when you have a breaking change, and also how to also have a consumer-driven contract testing in place as well. But from our perspective, from a startup perspective, we were a small team. We were in total 13 developers. And so it was still not consumer-driven contract testing, but communication to the other teams in terms of, okay, we are introducing a breaking change, so you have to adapt to that one. And also it's, I guess the more services and the bigger your team becomes, it makes more sense, and it's to automate these processes so that you have the chance to detect that you have introduced a breaking change by providing consumer-driven contract tests. By introducing CDC, and I guess it depends, like when it makes sense to introduce these things. It's how many services you are running, how big your team is.
I should add to that if you are providing services that, if you're running API endpoints, people outside of your, shall we say, immediate sphere of influence are using, don't expect you'll ever be able to deprecate an endpoint. So like version everything, because you'll be very sad if you're like, that it was a wonderful endpoint name. We can't use it anymore because that very important customer refuses to upgrade, and we can't turn that off. So now we just have like weird, V2 in everything, but we'd never had a V1.
Ken, any?
No, I think that's covered a lot of it, and I guess I would just add that CI/CD is probably one of the biggest factors in ensuring that you're keeping track of your versions properly, you know what's in production, you know what you can roll forward with in the previous version. Basically you've got a version, whether it's an API or a tagging or something, you just cannot not version to use microservices.
Okay.
I guess the biggest challenge that we had was not the REST API versioning, but the versioning of the messages, the events in our message broker, because it has when the services themselves, a lot of the services were communicating over Apache Kafka and events, and what we have had a lot of problems with versioning the payloads because they are exchanging the data as JSON data, and how to provide consumer-driven contract tests there as well. So that was a big challenge.
Okay, another question for the crowd. Is service mesh the future of microservices?
Well, I can start, but I'm sure both of these ladies will have opinions as well. It's the future for now. Whether it's the future in 10 years is another thing entirely. As I showed this morning, we tend to go in a cycle of embedding things to libraries, to middleware, to environment, and then back around the loop again. So we could easily find ourselves in 5 to 10 years saying, you know what, service mesh is too complicated, I want everything in my app again. Or we could find that there's some other level of abstraction that we've now gone to that isn't a service mesh, but is something else entirely.
Yeah, it also depends on your context. So if that's the future for your service-to-service communication, and so if you are running on a Kubernetes cluster, it makes total sense for me to introduce service meshes. But if you go one step further into the serverless direction, then it's in that case it's not relevant, and it could be also live side by side, so that you still have services that are communicating or are running on a Kubernetes infrastructure, but also introduce services that are require a very scalable backend and that can run side by side.
All right, 2 comments on service mesh. One is I read proposals for KubeCon EU. So this was the one that was happening last May. Excuse me. I read proposals for that and was upvoting talks, and I think I read about 60 proposals for service meshes, and a lot of them were like someone's GitHub pet project with, them and maybe one other contributor, and they were like, I'm going to give a talk about this thing. Like, if you decide to use some very cutting-edge tools, make sure you don't bleed by cutting yourself on them. Like, make sure if you're going to use something like Service Mesh that you maybe pick a project. I'm not going to endorse one. I'm just going to say pick a project that has a number of contributors in an active community, just like you're picking any other open source project. This one has a lot of hype around it right now, so just be cautious. And I guess the other thing is, again, like I really appreciated Susanne's point of, hey, maybe they make a lot of sense with your Kubernetes systems, they don't make a lot of sense with your serverless choices. And just remember that it's not like there's one right answer, and that's the one we're all using now, and then in 6 months we're all using the next one. Like, all right, any of us who have worked at a large enterprise know perfectly well that most of the things you put into production are going to outlast your tenure at the institution and possibly outlast all of us and possibly outlast the planet. So like, it's not that there's a right answer, there's the answer that solves the problems you have right now.
Okay. Another question, are microservices the new monoliths and serverless the new microservices?
I couldn't hear the first part.
Microservices.
Are they the new what?
Monolith.
This is, again, back to the hype-driven development. I mean, yes, there will always be the flavor of the week. You have to decide if it solves a problem that you actually have. And if the problem that you actually have is you really want to do some resume-driven development, like, okay, more power to you. Maybe don't tell your employer that you heard it at a conference that you could do that. But like, it's not that you should be on the new hotness, it's that you should use the tool that solves the problem you actually have. Also, if you flew here on an airplane or used a credit card today, you interacted with a mainframe. So like, the right tool for the job is not always the one that is the top hit on Hacker News right now.
And what I think is, so serverless is not only like functions, like your or so-called anti-pattern nanoservice, but what I think is it's more than just your function. It's also that it's abstracting away that's fully managed by your cloud provider, that you don't have to manage and provision your service anymore. And so I guess it's yeah. I guess you can't really derive the statement in terms of like that's the new the microservice, the monolith, and the serverless is the new microservice, because it has an additional context to that one.
I would just finish up by saying that I completely agree with Bridget in terms of it's the right tool for the right job, but I would also say that the comment doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, because it's all about perspective, in the sense that one man's monolith is another one's microservice, or vice versa. It all depends on your point of view. So you could think something's a monolith, someone else looks at it and says that's a microservice, and someone else could say something completely different. So saying that they're switching what they are just doesn't really fit. It's all about how you look at things.
There's a tweet of Andrew Clay Schaefer's that I love that says, "Who wants to argue with me about the definition of made-up words?"
Okay, another question. Embedded, like Netflix OSS, open source, versus delegated to the infrastructure like Istio. What are the advantages and trade-offs, in your opinion?
I guess from my perspective, the biggest advantage is you get something that's polyglot. So Netflix OSS obviously caters to the Java ecosystem, but with something like Service Mesh, providing the same capabilities allows you to run polyglot microservices, and they all get that facility for free by being in the virtue of the mesh.
And also a service mesh, so you don't have to, I would say, pollute your business domain or the domain model with infrastructure reliability concerns by using a client library taking care of client-side load balancers and circuit breaker. Instead, you are shifting this infrastructure concern to the service mesh itself, handling all these things, and then you don't have to integrate it. And also another option is, for example, so Netflix OSS, as far as I know, is pretty much wired to Java applications, services itself. But what happens if you use a different language like Go? How is then circuit breaking handled, and how do you do load balancing, client-side load balancing there? How do they communicate with a service registry? So I guess, and you don't have to deal with this anymore, because it's then standardized and it's shifted over, to the service mesh.
And I feel like the Netflix folks aren't on stage here to defend themselves, so I will say that they do have a slightly more heterogeneous environment these days. You can go look at talks at Velocity from Andrew Spyker, spelled S-P-Y-K-E-R, if you want to read more about some of the current stuff that they're doing.
And I would just also add that I'm pretty sure I've heard from secondhand that the Netflix people who are involved in writing all those libraries to begin with said that they would never have written those if Service Mesh existed at the time, because they wouldn't have needed to.
Don't we all feel that way about the stuff we did last year or 2 years ago?
Okay, another question. Is there a moment while evaluating a project where you just know if it should or should not be implemented using microservices?
I'll repeat it. I'll repeat what I thought I heard, at least, and you can tell me if it's right. When you're evaluating a project, is there like a rule or a rubric you can use to determine if it should or should not be implemented with microservices? Is that right?
So what I recommend is it has different dependencies. First is, it's always said like, okay, if you don't know your domain, for example, if you just start as a startup and you do a minimum viable product, that's the usual explanation not to start with microservices, but with monoliths. I don't know if that's, for me it's also very, very relevant how your team can handle these infrastructure complexities. And so if you have, only 3 people starting in a startup and doing a product that is not yet, you don't know the domain very well, I'm not sure if this is the right solution. And if I would do it, for example, if I would start a startup, probably I would try it out with serverless first and then to figure out what is not relevant to what I can't handle with serverless, and then do the other approach like microservice serverless side by side.
I think this kind of comes back to what I think we all touched on, which is complexity exists. You're going to pay the complexity tax. You have to decide where you want to pay it. If you want to pay it in a really complex infrastructure, you might get a really great trade-off in terms of having very flexible ease of use for the people who want to deploy something constantly without worrying about changing things in the infrastructure. But everything has trade-offs. I'm so sorry if you were lied to and you were told technology was easy. The door is somewhere behind me. But
Ken?
Oh, no, I think I'm good on that.
Okay. So another one, ThoughtWorks TechRadar still didn't put microservices into Adapt. So what do you think about the maturity of microservices?
So there is the TechRadar from ThoughtWorks, and they are investigating a lot of technologies. So I can't recall all the phases, but I know that they have not put microservices yet into the, I guess it's the adopt circle, where it says it has matured and it's a recommendation for every organization. So and that's something, it's still facing a lot of complexities, especially the infrastructure complexities. And as long as these are not really solved yet, I guess there's still some way to go to adopt microservices in your organization, and so I guess it has not reached the level yet that it's completely mature.
Yeah, I would also agree with that, and particularly when you think that 2 years ago the way to do things was with using Netflix libraries or something equivalent. Then along comes Service Mesh and it changes everything. It's at this stage very hard to say with any certainty that in another 18 months or 2 years there won't be something else that comes along that changes the landscape dramatically again. And until those things stop happening, there won't be any kind of stability around developing microservices.
I'm excited about this idea of technology somehow stabilizing, because I don't see that happening. I mean, I work for a cloud provider. As of today, you work for a cloud provider. And we're probably going to see an awful lot of the managed services that we heard about to great effect, which is to say, when you want to get something done, you're going to hopefully build the minimum viable infrastructure and write the minimum viable code to get to your goal, right? So if you can write some serverless functions and use that as a service, then you're not going to be wasting a lot of time writing something that you would throw away in 18 months, hopefully.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. Bridget, so how do you handle orchestration?
Okay, so I love this idea of orchestration because it sounds so simple, right? Like, we have technology, we definitely want to have some order in there. And it's like, okay. So you would like to Kubernetes, that's cool. Let's just pick one component to talk about, overlay network. Anyone have opinions? Because there's last time I checked, 17 or 18 choices. So I think there's a huge difference between picking something very structured. We just heard from the Pivotal folks, and they have some, Cloud Foundry is a very opinionated platform. There is a way you should do things, and you don't spend a lot of time building the platform. And all the way on the other end of the spectrum, we have something like Kubernetes, where, you can spend the entire time building the platform. There's a bucket full of Legos, and that's fun. And you probably, if you're trying to do something valuable for your organization, you might not want to spend, or at least your boss might not want you to spend all of the time using the bucket full of Legos to build something really fun. And I think that's where there's that difference, right, between the fun stuff in technology, which I would say, come work at a cloud provider if you want to build that platform, and the really useful stuff you're trying to build for your end users, for your stakeholders, for your organization's goals, in which case picking the least complicated technology possible is probably, from your point of view, moving the complexity to someone else's problem is a completely viable strategy so that you can spend time on your business logic.
I think that makes total sense, and you want to focus on what you do best and not trying to solve all these problems that other people have solved for you. So it's very much a case of if you can hand it off to someone else to deal with, then all the better.
So the first motivation to go into orchestration was when and a SaaS solution has to run on different cloud providers, abstracting away the infrastructure. So that was the first motivation for that I was diving into orchestration Kubernetes. But what I have experienced was, oh yeah, so I have a pod, I have a service, I have a deployment, I have a replica set. Yeah, okay, I got this. So and then I set it up, and then the other day, then I also have stateful set, then I have persistent volume claim, then I have persistent volume, so and then I have an endpoint. So every day a new primitive popped up to get used to and to explore it. So it was for me it has had a very steep learning curve, and I don't know all these 40 different primitives.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, I would say, complex open source project, fast moving. I run a workshop every month or so, and every single time there's a new release, we're rewriting parts of the workshop because things broke, because breaking changes. I will say that if you want to play with this sort of stuff yourself, the workshop that is, it's open source, so it's at container.training. Please put pull requests in with everything that you want in there. And it's, again, learning some Kubernetes or writing some serverless functions or getting into service mesh aren't goals in and of themselves, right? If those are goals in and of themselves for you, you should definitely contribute to a bunch of the open source projects. I posted my slides. Definitely want contributors if you are excited about the tooling. And if you're trying to get something done with it, go to the minimum viable. As little as you can get. I think Charity Majors of Honeycomb puts it all code is technical debt. The code that you don't have to write is not your problem. So only write the code you have to, because you have to maintain it.
Thanks a lot, Bridget. So now it's over. So there is a few questions that we didn't have the time to answer. We have a meet and greet right now, just in the main room. So I will ask you to ask the panelists in private in the meet and greet session. Thanks.
Thank you.